Welcome back, Dance Aloud listeners, to our July podcast. And this is a unique episode because it's just going to be me. It's just going to be solo Andrew today, flying solo. The reason for that is that we just couldn't get our schedules together for Francis and Ed and all of us to actually record this month. So I was sitting on something that I probably would do in a situation like this, and that's to literally revisit the first episode, but not like one of those ones where we go back and play the first episode. It's redo, in fact, my interview that Ed did with me on my deconversion story, but much more detail and sort of go in. So if you have been following us from the beginning, you will remember that, and you may have had some questions to say, I wonder what he would think about this, or he would think about that, or did he go through this, or what's it like, to have that kind of journey. So I have been thinking about sort of just broadly looking at that sort of my life journey in the Christian faith and out of the Christian faith, and why it matters so much now to talk about such things as we do in this podcast and what's going on there, rather than just looking at these sort of very interesting and academic subjects. Or counter-apologetics is what we're really about, I suppose. And the motivations for that. And we touched into this in interviewing Ed and me and Francis as well, motivations and reasonings. And I suppose for anybody listening, every subject is fascinating, some more interesting than others for each of you. Some people might just be pretty bored by some and it's all over their head, and others just, wow, that's really interesting, would like to hear more about that. So to talk about my journey from sort of from the outset, I'd have to sort of give the background of but rather than sort of talking about deconverting, it's what about converting? How did that happen? And I like to use the phrase that everything's sort of sourced and copied from somewhere, isn't it, more or less, with our own nuances. The phrase from Bart-Ehrman, which is he was born again and then became dead again. A friend of his said that you've become dead again. So when did I become dead again? Or when did I become born again? So that I'd like to start right back there. So I grew up in southwest England, in Devon. So for anybody listening from the States, it's I'm not sure. I'm just trying to think of any films that have been set down that way, and nothing comes to mind at the moment. Except for a film called Hot Fuzz. Where it talks, and they go down to Devon and have the Devonshire accent down there in Devon, southwest England. So I grew up partly there, and I also grew up partly in New Zealand before that, and then in Brighton in England before that. So I was born into a family that was actually what you'd probably call now a secular family, sort of non-Christian, pagan, as some people might want to call it. But basically not religious, certainly not religious in any organized religious sense. My father, though, was very what's the word? I think you could call him, probably, maybe people looking back may have touched into New Age thought, very different, not necessarily not at all materialism and atheism at that level. But certainly not Christian. When we moved to New Zealand, my parents had split up, and I had a new situation in which I had a stepfather and mother. And it was at that point that they had, I would say, and they would probably say today, had radical Christian conversions into evangelical Christianity. So from that point onwards, my brother and I were sort of, in a sense, just suddenly changed environments from sort of this secular, non-Christian environment to a Christian environment, going to church, Sunday schools, and all the rest of it in New Zealand. When we emigrated back, we ended up joining a local Baptist church in Devon, back to Devon, and I'm sorry, not back to Devon. So I grew up, was in Brighton to New Zealand and then to Devon. Went to a Baptist church, spent the next sort of 8 years there in Devon. And that church experience was split between a Baptist church, which was not so charismatic, to then a charismatic church in a school hall, which was very charismatic. During that period, we'd go to Bible camps. And at one particular Bible camp, I can remember saying, and I think I remember this on the original podcast, at a Bible camp, somebody from somebody from my church, actually, sort of more like a youth leader, came into the tent, actually, where I was at Bible camp. And he was talking about becoming born again. And he said a phrase that I've never forgotten. So God has no grandchildren. You can't piggyback on your parents' faith and you're a Christian. It has to be your own personal thing. So I became a Christian, I believe, that night when that happened. And I did feel, from my memory, it's interesting how psychology may work in reality, a spiritual kind of experience or some sort of nice inner warm feeling. I've since discovered many people have this in different religious experiences. It's not just becoming a Christian. And but at the time, you would associate that with something pretty real and powerful. And why not? I mean, it was taken very seriously by me. And I then sort of felt that I had joined the believing community, I suppose. I'm going to say join the club, join the believing community. And I really, really, really took my faith fairly seriously right from then onwards. I think I had a very strong experience. I kind of, in a sense, just was opened up to that world and just sort of like, in one sense, in a way, knew it was true, and believed it. But I wanted to understand what was true and learn more about it. And I was only 11, so it's like, wow. So I think as I got more into teenagehood and a bit later, I was very, very serious. And I realized now, looking back, that I was quite a studier. And a lot of my friends were more sort of, just in the faith and believing and no doubting the sincerity of the faith at all. But I was more interested with that, with the Bible, with what it said. And I was struck by the end times. The end times were definitely something that was very much in our household and had a very strong influence on me. And I realize now, and I mentioned this before, I sort of coined my own phrase. I felt that I was an apocalyptic child. And what I mean by that was that the end times was so affecting on me that I didn't think that we had long left on the planet. And the goal was to evangelize as many people as possible, a bit like a sinking ship, I suppose, and trying to rescue people from the Titanic, the spiritual Titanic of the earth. And I honestly didn't think I would make it past my, I don't know, by that time I was thinking like this, about 16, 17 years old. I thought I might not make 18. I really was affected by end times theology. One of my strong memories in this was a series called Thief in the Night movies. And they were 70s movies that were shown in churches right through the 70s into the 80s. And they were the precursors to the Left Behind series. So anyone listening to this and think of end times, think of Tim Lay and the Left Behind series. Well, it was all, that was in the 90s, I believe, when that came out in the books. It was all 25 years before that we had a book, very much a big book at the time called, it was before my time really, but it was in 1971 called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. That theology had infected the church in America and a lot of churches in England. So it was all kind of talking about the rapture and things like that. That was very much on my mind, this imminent rapture, that Jesus would be coming back soon to rapture his believers away. And that book, I think, must have had some influence on the films called Thief in the Night, A Distant Thunder, and Mark of the Beast, and something like that. I forget what the fourth one was or which one round they were, but they were films that were shown. And actually, I think in hindsight, they're quite traumatic to children. And somebody listening to this podcast might come from a background where they know exactly what I'm talking about. These films, and fairly recently, I've actually watched, I think I'm on the third one now. I wanted to rewatch them. And it's certainly the first and second one borders between bad acting, very bad filming, and almost laughable, to actually horror moments that are so still traumatic and scary to watch, even in my age now, in my 50s. And And there was a period where I met somebody. I talked a bit later, talk about a group called YWAM that I joined, a missionary organization. But I met someone there, or two people there in that period. And I think it was in the 90s, we actually found the Thief in the Night film and we watched it for sort of some inner kind of healing. And we were just laughing our way through it and all the rest of it, but also pointing out that it was pretty eerie and still pretty affecting. And that was the Thief in the Night movie. And it was very, very horrific, that one. And the second one, where if you didn't become a Christian and the rapture came, you'd be left to this horrific tribulation. A tribulation which then, if you didn't recant your faith, if you did become a Christian, you would be beheaded. And it had scenes building up to that, and even showing it to a sort of a degree. And it was pretty horrific for anybody being shown as a kid in churches. I don't know, you'd never get away with it now, I don't think. And so this was traumatic. I think it's an inner trauma that many, many thousands of people perhaps across the world may have been affected by that Thief in the Night movie and The Distant Thunder. I never did see the newer versions. Probably they're a lot tamer in this respect. And talking about scaring people into the kingdom and sort of traumatizing a child. And that is not even to do with talking of hell and traditional ideas about hell on those that don't believe and your family members that don't believe. It's simply just about missing out on the rapture, and you'll be left behind. And there's a famous song, Larry Norman, don't get left behind, don't get left behind. And so this was a widespread view. It was a lot later in theological college that I'd found that view was actually more of a 19th century innovation in the way that it was spun and talked about, and particularly the separation between a so-called second coming and a rapture, and that it was a novel idea in church history and not actually true according to what you could find in pre-church history. And so therefore it makes it worse to think that all that was said and done when it's actually a novel idea relative to 2000 years of church history. So that was an encompassing aspect of my memory of my childhood Christianity. But some people would say, was it real? Was it just all intellectual? And I'd say no. I took it very seriously. I prayed. I had the born again experience. I wanted to know. I mean, I was so frightened of not being saved. I actually got baptized when no one was being baptized. So I was baptized in the bath. And that haunted me for years because I felt that it wasn't a real baptism, because so it was haunting me not that I was baptized. So I baptized in the bath. And then it was haunting me that because I was baptized in the bath with just my parents there, then it wasn't real. And so I felt that I was, you get to, it's amazing, isn't it? You get to this judgment day and then say, I'm sorry, you're meant to be baptized as a believer in front of a whole community, not in the bath. I went to my pastor about this and said, I'm really, really worried that it's not valid. And he said, no, it'd be valid if you believed at the time and all the rest of it. So I was sort of rested assured. So this shows you the sort of mindset that I was in at these periods and how serious it was. And why not? I mean, this wasn't a game. This was discovering and being part of the truthful reality of the world and discovering Jesus and having a relationship with God and doing the right thing, but at the same time being frightened that you've done the wrong technical thing and you'll be disbarred from heaven or whatever the outcome was meant to be. As time moved on in sort of my teenagehood, I realized that in the youth group, I kind of really got into theology and different aspects of the Bible. And so sort of 15, 16, 17, I can remember friends going out to a party at the weekend, some sort of, I don't know, just enjoyment stuff. And I would thoroughly like to stay home and study the Bible. And I remember clearly one day studying a Jehovah's Witness Bible and marking out where it was all wrong, and oddly enough, there's a little thing about that I'll bring back a bit later about hell. But I was just going through the Bible and saying, well, they've obviously got that wrong and they've got that wrong and they've got that wrong. And it was like, how did I know at 15 who was right about anything in reality? But I can clearly remember that period. I would speak in youth groups sometimes. I remember speaking on the end times. I remember speaking on the amillennialism, premillennialism, and postmillennialism. And if anyone doesn't know what that is, it's to do with what happens when Jesus comes back. What are the surrounding events and scenarios? And so a classic one is that there is this rapture, there's a 7-year tribulation, which I've mentioned. Then Jesus comes back to the actual planet. And actually bases himself in Jerusalem. And then there's 1,000 years of sort of peaceful reign on earth with the church and with presumably rest of humanity. And I don't know how it all blends in. It's all kind of complex. And then after that 1,000 years, the devil comes back into the scene because he's bound. Suddenly there's this massive great big war and destruction and everything else. And then there's the end of the world and a new heavens and a new earth. Other people taught that we're in a millennium now, and that since Jesus come, it's inaugurated a whole sort of period of something, and then Jesus comes back in the second coming. Post-millennialism is a bit like that. It's just that post-millennialism has most of the world becomes Christian, and then Jesus comes back. And so I spoke on this, clearly showing that amillennial and post-millennial were non-truth, and that premillennial and rapture was truth. And so, well, again, what did I know? I was only 15 or 16, but I read a book and went with my parents and just taught that. And so, it's kind of embarrassing to look back, but I suppose we all, as we embark on life in any worldview, we either sort of copy what our peers or parents say, and until we're exposed to other aspects of real life, real human beings, and real differences and real perspectives, we just are in an echo chamber and just put that echo chamber out. And I suppose we're always in danger of that. Even now, doing this podcast in this area of counter-apologetics, it's easy to find echo chambers to back up everything and something to be watched. So, and we move on a bit more from that time. I took my faith so seriously, and I did think the end times were coming soon. And I think evangelism was the most important thing. So I didn't really have a view about a lifetime job, getting married or having kids. I do remember thinking that I wanted to be able to drive a car before Jesus came back. I wanted to grow a beard before Jesus came back. And then I think I wanted to have sex before Jesus came back, like in a legitimate sense of getting married. But I thought, oh, what a shame, because it's probably not going to happen. And again, my mind, the young mind, it's so funny to think back on that. I thought those things, that those were the big things for me. I didn't want this rapture to come until those things had happened. And that, who would have said, so 40 years later now, that those things did happen. I've got a beard right now, and grown up kids. So that's, part of the story of it more than a generation later, and nothing happened, nothing came about. Still nothing is happening and coming about in that way. So I've grown up with that environment, and I would have to say that, again, that apocalyptic child in me did affect my life. It didn't give me a long-term view of career, a long-term view of that we're here for the long haul and put your tracks down and source that. It was more like it could end any minute, and that ending any minute means that you live life like you're on the Titanic about to go down, not on some developing place that's growing bigger and better, hopefully, or trying to make it better, trying to counter things going wrong. So that was my sort of background in that way. Again, back into this period when I was taking it seriously, I then got onto the other end. I realized that the big issues within Christianity for me, in my small little world, were the end times and the beginning. It was issues of evolution and faith, and I was or creation at the time that it was put to me. So there was a dichotomy there in the way that it was presented to me, that evolution was wrong. Ideas of evolving from common ancestry between we have a common ancestor with apes had a common ancestor that we came from and they came from, sort of thing, in evolution over many millions of years. That the earth was 4.5 billion years old. All of this was lies. That the truth was that the world was young, probably 6,000 years old. Let's stretch it to 10, maybe. Some people said that for some strange reason, probably to do with the genealogies in the Bible. And so that, again, set something in me, and maybe some listeners can identify with this. There's a strange thing that happens if you're told stuff as a child, even when you're my age now, which is in my 50s. I've academically believed in evolution since even when I was a Christian, probably in my early 20s. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But it doesn't stop you even now. If, say, someone like on a biology program, for those in England, you'll be familiar with someone called David Attenborough. obviously, but in America you may have not, or in other parts of the world you may not know who I'm talking about. But just say there's a biology program and someone says, now this rock is 3 million years old, because and immediately there's a little thing in me that goes, lies, that's of the devil. How do you know? You weren't there, and people will realize, if they know anything about young earth creationism and the Kentucky-based creationist museum there with Ken Ham, that kind of teaching was the sort of teaching that I was reared on within my home and by some people in the church. But here's the beginning of the end. If I source it back to what really caused my faith problems a lot later in life. So I don't mean anything started about my end of my faith in my teens at all, but the principle is seeded right there. I then started to become aware of differences within Christianity. It's all very fine saying, those out in the world, you don't understand, you're blind, you have the devil has deceived you, you need to come to the truth, become born again, see the light, see the truth, see the matrix, to use that film's concept. The real truth is everyone is under the world of the devil and they're on the dark side. You come to the truth. I found that slightly problematic when I found other Christians disagreed with other Christians. Now, some people out there may say, well, what's the problem with that? It's just normal life. Yeah, it is. It's normal life in every single sphere. But I found it a problem because, the Bible was taught as inerrant, and it was the word of God, and it was the Protestant Bible with 66 books, and that it spoke of one voice. And some people use the term today, univocal, that it speaks with one voice, because even though it had multiple authors and spanned over many hundreds of years, that it was one voice of the Holy Spirit that wrote everything, really, even though we had acknowledged human writers were different and wrote stuff. And I found it hard to see that, again, I didn't piece it together back then, but over the years, I sort of look back and say, yeah, there's where the issue is. My problems were that, okay, so why can't all Christians understand the Bible then? Why? And I thought I was lucky. Why am I the lucky one to be in the charismatic church? Premillennialism is true. Young earth creationism is true. I'm lucky to have found the pristine form of Christianity. I then since realized that I got the implication that Catholics weren't Christians until I met later Christians who saw things differently. I'd never even heard of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And I knew about cults like Jehovah's Witnesses weren't Christians and all the rest of it. What I didn't realize is that all these groups believed they were Christians, true Christians, from their point of view. Their sincerity took them that way. I didn't think that, I'm a Jehovah's Witness and I know we're wrong. I'm a Catholic, and of course it's the whore of Babylon in the book of Revelation, and I just want to be part of that evil community. No, everybody thought that they were had the right belief. And this is what caused me a problem. I was thinking, hang around. So how would I know I have the right belief as a Protestant charismatic Christian who believes in young earth creationism and evolution was wrong, and other views as well? Like at that particular time, women couldn't be a minister in a church from the truth of the Bible in what I was being taught, or that we were all sinners in Adam, that Adam sinned and then all of us were sinners because he sinned, original sin. That was the way I was taught. These were the truths of Christianity. How come I've got the truth? How do I know that we've got the right understanding? So that led me more into studying the Bible. And then as I started to study the Bible, you then think, well, I can't understand it. I don't even read Hebrew, can't read Greek. What do I know? I just got people at church telling me stuff, and then I'm reading the Bible. Then I start reading books about the Bible, and read Second Coming books and end time books and books on creation and evolution. Of course, these books that I would have read at first would have been supporting the views that I was already taught. So that wasn't necessarily that helpful, but it did lead me to the quotes within those books would reference other Christians who said different things. Other Christians, not non-Christians, other Christians said this. They believe in the millennium because of this. They believe in evolution and not young earth creation because of this. And I was thinking, I was starting to get interested in those other Christians. Who are this mysterious breed? You might think there was one or two evolutionists in our church, and the thing I got was that they're kind of wrong, and they're sort of suckering up to the world, or they don't believe in the rapture as separate from the second coming. What? And so I had this kind of thing going on. And this was, again, 15, 16, 17, 18 now. Then I came to the point of struggling with that. But I became, on the devotional side, I was very into thinking about, we need to tell people about Jesus, get them into the kingdom and get them ready for the end times and get as many saved as possible. And that was really what wasn't important about going to college at that point, or a lifetime job or a career or anything like that. It was important about saving people from, at that particular point, very strong natural teaching from these churches of eternal hell, so that if you weren't a Christian, you were going to an ever conscious suffering of hell, that you would be in hell consciously suffering torment and pain as long as God was God and as long as the saved were in heaven. That was the teaching, and that's the standard view in many churches for many hundreds of years, in one form or another. People then, we'll get onto how that was the biggest subject that I studied later in life, and came to some surprising conclusions actually on that. And I think we've mentioned that in the podcast. So then I heard about this group called YWAM. It's called Youth with a Mission. And it was a missionary organization that was largely aimed at sort of collating young people from churches to do sort of evangelism, presumably in that sort of period before they say go to university or college. And some people would then end up staying in the mission and not go to college, and they do their own studies at that mission and become sort of leaders in that sort of missionary organization. And in fact, looking back in hindsight, it can be seen to have been a little bit cultish in its structure. Certainly in different parts of the world, it could be experienced like that. But I didn't experience like a cult, but it probably is. But then what is a cult? Is the church a giant cult? Any movement can have these sort of power structures. But to me, it was a great experience. And I went to YWAM. It was also a challenging experience. It was also, again, building up on the seeds of what would be my deconversion. It was there that I experienced properly for the first time, when I was 18 and 19, properly, these so-called other forms of Christians. This so-called ones that in the books would say, those over there who are wrong, error, they're in error. They have biblical error. They're not in the truth in this area. They may be saved, but they're not in the truth in these areas. I met Christians who didn't believe in original sin in the classic sense that I taught. I was taught that they didn't, and the reason why? The Bible didn't teach it from their perspective. Wow. And I met people who thought, the first place where we went, there was a woman singing and leading worship with a guitar. When I say leading worship, I mean leading the church service within the setting of this sort of college campus community of evangelism that I was part of in not far from London, actually, between London and Brighton. I did a 3-month course there, and then I ended up joining the missionary movement, assisting in a Christian school after that. So that was my first sort of experience in this sort of movement. So I was in a sort of, I suppose I experienced it like going to college in terms of the social life. So I have very good memories of the time with all the people, but it was meeting different Christians and different understandings that really threw me. I met Christians who didn't believe the earth was young, that they believed it was 4.5 billion years old. That was a shock, real shock. And that they had their sort of different version of understanding Genesis that way. And then later on in the churches, I met other people who split on this, and it was either a sort of acceptable split and they weren't sort of disparaging each other too much on this. Although I got the feeling that young earth creationism slowly was being sort of almost laughed at as silly interpretation, and novel in church history. Then I discovered a particular radical form of theology at this missionary group, and it was what's now called open theism, and which is pretty seen as heretical by mainstream evangelical churches. And yet again, the reason for it isn't because people want to believe non-truths; they just believe that the Bible is speaking truths these ways. And so open theism was around in this missionary movement like decades before it's become a known theological term in a lot of churches now. If you're into theology and stuff, anyone listening will know what I'm talking about. We've done an episode on open theism and what that means. It's almost like the extreme opposite to Calvinism, if you know what that means. And we've talked about that on the podcast. That's to do with the notions that God is, in open theism, kind of, in one sense, inside time, not outside time. He's not eternal in the sense of outside of time, that he is a being that progresses through time. That's his nature, that the past disappears, the future isn't here yet, even for him. He knows all what could happen, but not necessarily what will happen, because that's up to us. That's open theism, and a lot of it makes sense with a lot of narratives of the Old Testament. We've talked about this in the podcast. This was very appealing to me, but very shocking to me. And of course, communicating it back home was like, well, you're in a cult, you're teaching heresy, no original sin, open theism, what's going on? Women leading worship services. Women preaching, what wasn't allowed in my church, but it was here in the missionary organization. And I was thinking, what's causing that? Well, people would turn to these verses in the Bible and say, Mary spoke, and these verses mean this, and these other verses are interpreted in context. And my journey on this has been phenomenal, because now I have an understanding of why I feel all these different views happen. It's because the Bible isn't univocal. And it isn't of one voice. So different church traditions pick up on one voice, build on it, and reinterpret the other voices. And then another church will listen to that voice, build on it, and reinterpret those other verses. And hence you get people at war. So the villain is actually a non-univocal Bible. That's what I came to many, many years later, to understand these conflicts. It isn't to do with misunderstanding, it's to do with the Bible itself is non-univocal, and it explains an awful lot. If you take that view, it solves an awful lot, even if you realize that different views can cause the brain to go all over the place if you're seeking to be a believer in Jesus. So in that missionary organization, I struggled. I remember talking to a couple of people on my first course there, saying that I really struggled with the fact that, there's this view about women can't teach, and they can. There's this view on God's knowledge, Calvinism, premillennialism, creationism. And this was just the beginning. I didn't know how many conflicts within Christianity there were. And there are so many. And those of you who've listened to this channel will know I've done a channel on YouTube called Christian Diversity, tackling 14 of these subjects. And I had 24 to do. I just didn't finish them. With what was going on in my life at the time. So if we move on at this particular thing, I then joined this YWAM group, and I was there for 2 years, and I just struggled with the theology, really. I struggled between what I should believe in many areas. I was starting to read books on science, and became realization that the world was really old, that it was acceptable as a Christian to believe in evolution and blend it with your faith in a way. It doesn't have to be a complete abandonment of science or the general accepted science of evolution. That's a hard pill to swallow when you realize that you're up against 99% of biologists in the world is under a conspiracy of false interpretation of the data. I mean, that's a hard. You'd have to really be sure of what you're talking about to go that far. I mean, it's like, the whole world just doesn't know the truth. When a lot of these people, or most of them, are probably sincerely, honestly trying to discover the data of the planet, and none of them are coming up. This looks like the world really started about 6,000 years ago, and all the evidence is pointing to it. And so it's a mystery how it happened, but that's where the evidence. That's not what science had come to. It was that the world is billions of years old, and that animal species change over time, and natural selection and Darwin, and built up from there. And so if you were going to have a faith at all, you have to blend it in with evolution. In my 20s, I did that. And I never saw the real serious problem with evolution and the Bible, but actually now I see there's massive problems with it. There's many problems with evolution in the Bible as there is with young earth creationism and science. And so I certainly have an understanding of why a fundamentalist would be a young earth creationist. I certainly understand that. I certainly understand why an evolutionist could not become a creationist from a scientific point of view as well. A young earth creationist, that is. So I call myself not a theistic evolutionist. That's sort of like an old hat term. I used to call myself a evolutionary creationist. So I would immediately disarm. Oh, do you believe in evolution or creation? No, I'm an evolutionary creation. In other words, God created through evolution or by evolutionary processes. That seemed to settle me for a while in that area. So as I moved on, I then left that missionary group and then sort of got a job, and I ended up sort of starting a sort of a mid-range, low-end maybe career of video editing and filming for various companies and education establishments. And I really did that for most of my life, and I still do that a little bit now. Hence, it sort of set the platform for me to be able to record podcasts and do my YouTube channel anyway, quite early on, before many people jumped on that bandwagon. So, but as part and behind that work, I used to think of that as tent making, as we used to say. What Apostle Paul made tents, but his real thing was this. So my real thing was, this is to keep the family and sort of 9 to 5 kind of work approach. And the real issue was the truths of Christianity and evangelization. And so I eventually joined a very charismatic church in London. And it was through that church that I first experienced another major difference. It really affected my life massively. And I don't know if there's anybody out there who would identify with this, but in this particular church, there's a very well respected sort of theologian, pastor, very intelligent, very, very from sort of Cambridge background, and knew the Bible backwards and everything. I had a lot of respect for him. He held the view that hell wasn't actually eternal conscious torment for those that wouldn't be Christians in the end, or wouldn't be saved in the end for whatever situation might lead to that. He held the view that, he put it in a very diplomatic kind of way, but he said that, through church history, it wasn't always eternal conscious torment. There was universalism. That's where, if to put it simply, we've done a podcast on this, if you want to go back. There's universalism, there's ultimate annihilationism, and there's the eternal torment view, and that these can be found all in different aspects in church history. I thought, well, I'm not just taking his word for it. I'm going to look at this, because hell had really affected me. I don't know if anyone would identify with this as I waffle on. I should call this episode Andrew Waffles On. But I sat down and sort of maybe I'd wake up in the night, not so much for my own fear of myself of being saved, but I thought, oh, what a crazy universe we're in. That the reality is that there's 5 back then, there's probably 5 billion people on the earth. I know we're 8 now. And that's what makes it even worse. There's now 3 more billion people to see if they're going to go to heaven or so-called hell in this traditional sense. But I just thought, you'd wake up and I'd go, this crazy universe, what is it that these human beings, you birth a baby, they grow up and they don't become a Christian, and then they suffer forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, all because they didn't believe in Jesus, or because they sinned in Adam. And I felt that was unfair. So you don't even get a chance not to sin in one sense, because you've sinned in Adam and you need salvation. And what if you don't find it because you've sinned in Adam? You're going to hell. I thought this was so bizarre. I sort of didn't sit with it, as a human being. It didn't resonate that this could be the reality at all. So you'd have these moments in my faith of quite strong faith and belief. I'd have these weak moments where I suddenly saw a glimpse of problem. And the way I describe it is like on a train at night. You're going past a dark building, and then suddenly you go to an alleyway and the light shines through, and then you go back to a dark building again. I see now, it's almost like, from a Christian point of view, those are moments of doubt. From a humanist point of view, those are moments of light. to something isn't right from your own inner human being, whatever it's drawing from, it's not sitting well. This idea that billions of people would be going to this hell because they didn't believe the right thing, and they were condemned in Adam in the first place, it just didn't wash deep down. Then suddenly the light would go, I'd be back again to the normal faith and just have some sort of rational explanation of it. So when I heard this pastor talk about hell in this way, he said that hell in the Bible was misinterpreted, and that the early church, the primitive church, had the right view. And that right view was, in fact, that even though the imagery of judgment and fire and hell is used in the Bible, it's used in the context of being destroyed. It's used in the context of like lifting the Old Testament passages where God's wrath and anger would come and literally burn people up and destroy them, kill them. The flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, those were illustrations. In fact, in Jude, it talks about Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of those that suffer the punishment of eternal fire. You go, oh my goodness, that's a different idea. So you mean God's wrath is like an experience, but it's not an infinite experience. It's a judgment period or moment in which people are destroyed. There may be wailing, gnashing of teeth, pain, suffering, but it's all over in a sort of a conflagration of judgment, and they will never rise again to live. And I thought, oh my gosh, that reads so on every page of the Bible in a way, or many, many pages of the Bible. If you saw it that way, if you saw that human beings weren't eternal by nature, but were destructible or preservable. And then I was drawn back to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, that if they remained in the garden in that story and ate of the tree of life, they would live forever, but they were banished, so they wouldn't live forever, and they went back to dust. So the principle of living forever being a good thing with God and ceasing to live was a bad thing, and from sin, really contradicted the traditional view of hell, because their traditional view of hell meant that you would live in heaven forever and you would live in hell forever. It's just different location. Whereas this view of conditional immortality or annihilation made so much sense that God is the source of all life. He maintains all life. He brings all spirits or souls or bodies and everything else, however you want to see it, into being. He completely has the ability to remove you from your being. And suddenly verses would stand out of the Bible like nothing else, like he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. Horrific image, but it's not the eternal torment image. He'll burn up the chaff, get rid of it. Jesus' statement in Matthew 10:28, fear him who can destroy body and soul in Gehenna. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, it does sound like he will destroy you in Gehenna. And it's hard to imagine a sort of a perpetual process of being continuously destroyed all through eternity. There comes a point where you are destroyed and you remain so if you're not brought back. So this idea of hell really made sense to me. And it kind of gave me a new rejuvenation, if that's the word, of the faith, strangely enough. It's not like I had the reaction of, oh, well, if there's no eternal hell, then I'll just give it up, live how I want. No way. I felt that, oh my gosh, this is a way of, instead of this eternal torture chamber for millions of people, it's like, if you don't want to ultimately die a second death, because it would be a second death, not the same as the first death, and you don't want to die a painful death in the presence of God, then you can live forever. And it was like, so eternal life really is a true gift. It's not just a change of location. Wow. My whole theology changed. At the same time, I knew I was entering what other people would call a heresy, or embracing what they would call a doctrine of demons, because I believed this. And then suddenly I'd be almost like a cult member. And now I'll draw back to that Jehovah's Witness time when I was 15 studying their Bible, and they had a view of annihilationism, reading the Bible that way. And I was crossing it out and saying, this is wrong. And And now I realize that the Jehovah's Witnesses were onto something in their study of the Bible that goes back way further than them. It goes back to the primitive church. I studied church history. I spent hours and hours and many years privately actually looking at this subject like a nerd, like a complete nerd, when people were enjoying life, having a parties, or just having enjoyable Christian life. I was studying these way before the internet, going up to libraries and studying studying ancient 19th century books or books on the first few centuries of the church, all to do with hell. And I came in no uncertain terms to think that the primitive church believed in this view. And I still believe that to this day, that that's what they believed, that it wasn't until a mix of Greek philosophy and the immortal soul got blended with Christian view of destruction by fire that it got morphed and twisted into an eternity of pain rather than a destruction of being in the fire. And the fire was the fire of God's judgment. And so anyway, so I'm reasoning I'm talking about this particular subject. It was the biggest thing for me. And I think I spent probably from 1989 to possibly, 1995 or something, seriously studying this subject until I was saturated in all the history of this view. Since then, back, if I should jump ahead to now, I do think that it's very easy to try and systemize the Bible. If once you see it as a univocal, as one voice, as I've mentioned, then you have to take all your verses and then shove other verses to fit it in some way. And that by and large, doesn't need to be done with this view of hell, of the annihilationist view, but it does have a few passages that you have to do a little bit of that with. They don't all sit nicely in that view. And I've come to think that one or two passages can certainly read like eternal torment without doubt. But by and large, the mass really do, I think, convey the idea of the ultimate annihilation view. And there's good reasons for it. But I'm sort of think now that, along with all kinds of other views in the Bible, that people take certain passages that read a certain way and then fit the others in. I'm quite prepared to say, well, this bit may be referring to that, and this passage in Romans may seem to be universalistic. It certainly reads that way and looks like it. This verse, I remember at university when I studied, a lot later, I went to study theology at university. And the lecturer did a whole thing one day on universalism, and I could not believe the power of the argument, quoting Bible passages left, right, and center. I was sitting there stunned, thinking, even within my understanding of the Bible, I thought, yeah, that if you just gave those to people, they would definitely have that feeling. So I begin to think that the Bible did have different voices even in this area, but predominantly it's the annihilationist view. So as I continue to waffle, that really affected my Christian life. I saw the world differently. I thought, oh my gosh, so there's going to come a point where non-Christians and anyone who's not saved will experience the heat of judgment, so to speak, according to their sins, and then there will be no more. That was the scenario. And then those that were Christians are the only ones that lived forever in the universe somewhere, New Earth or whatever. And that, to me, revolutionized my faith. It took a burden off me that was so strong. I felt the weight had lifted of this eternal torture chamber to more of a I suppose you could say it's a survival of the fittest, but by belief in Jesus. Another way of looking at it, you will get eternal life by belief in Jesus. It sounds so, it has a ring of truth to it with the Bible language, for God so loved the world that whosoever believe in him should not perish, sort of break up, die, pass away, but live forever or abide forever with Jesus. So even the language of John seems to fit that concept, rather than for God so loved the world that whosoever believeth in him shall live forever in fire or live forever in heaven. This is the way I would have thought then, and still think that now, if I was to be asked what the Bible teaches. So I mentioned that as a big aspect of my journey, so I had to go into detail there. So as I moved on through sort of the Christian period, I then started to still have a lot of doubts about the faith because of further belief in my experience of Christianity in different beliefs was getting so bad, in the sense that there was so many differences, so many disagreements on what the Bible said. And this is before I knew the Catholics had a different set of books in their Bible that I wasn't even reading. But to understand the 66 books was hard enough. And I realized people had different views on the atonement, which shocked me, that they didn't, there was different understandings of the atonement. And some people didn't accept the standard view that Jesus was punished in our place, in the sense that he took our punishment upon him. That there was views of the atonement that didn't agree with that. And they thought that was unbiblical. Like I said, women and science and faith and evolution, all of that was still going on, and I was on the evolutionary side. Calvinism is still going on, but there's other views as well. There's sort of views on lordship salvation. Is salvation, can you lose your salvation? Was around at the time in my missionary group. It was very strongly taught that you could lose your salvation every day, depending on your sin, and repentance. And it was like frightening to think that you could be so devout as a Christian, sin badly that day, and miss out on heaven if you died. And then I met other Christians that seemed to think that even if once you've given your life to the Lord, even if you live like the devil and deny the faith, you're saved. So I had to my brain had to sort of cater with these different forms of Christianity ever more in these different subjects. I was confused over, brought up that Israel, literal national Israel, currently was very, very key to Christianity, that they were God's people in a sense, that they will be key to the end times, and that we should support Israel and everything else. And then I met Christians in this later church I was in that were all supportive of Palestinians that were being persecuted by Israel. over in the current situation, that Israel weren't the key to the end times. The national Israel right now weren't the key to the end times, and that was a wrong understanding of the Bible. So it's another confusion I had to work through, and I sort of went that way, away from the support of Israel. And so I found myself almost like within my faith being slightly eroded by a sea. I can only think of it a bit like a ship that's sunk, and you're trying to grab different things that are floating, and sort of I'm floating now on Calvinism, I'm floating on open theism, I'm floating on evolutionism view, I'm floating on the women can be a minister view, and I was jumping from different boards in metaphorically in my life, and that was my Christianity, so confused by who is right. It's very dangerous to be wrong, because I'm told that my view of hell is heresy, and believing in evolution is a lie, and so what am I to do? Will the real truth stand up? And so that idea, that concept of will the real Jesus stand up, is really the seeds of my own personal deconversion story. It's just discovering that there are so many Jesuses, so many versions of Christianity, so many, as my YouTube channel shows. That's been in the links of the podcast many times, I think. It shows the diversity of within Christianity. And then it really is, will the real Jesus please stand up? Anyway, I've been going 50 minutes now, and I'm going to do a part 2 to this, because there's a lot more to do for my deconversion story. So I hope this has really interested you, and I know it's been different, and I've probably been missing Francis and Ed. So we'll do a part 2 to this for the August podcast, and then we'll reconvene with Francis and Ed with an interesting subject for the September podcast. So again, hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you found it really interesting, and hope some of it resonates with you, or maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But until next time, I've been your solo host, Andrew.